Tonight, we begin with something quieter, something ancient, but still trembling beneath the surface of every uncertain moment. We're stepping into the hidden chambers of Babylon, not with armies or rebellion, but with quiet courage, with steady trust, with the kind of peace that lingers, even in the shadow of lions. This isn't a story of roaring defiance. It's the story of a man who knelt, even when the world was watching. A man who carried faith not as armor, but as stillness, as surrender, as the quiet, unwavering belief that presence goes with us, even when the den closes in. So, before we follow him too far into the shadows, take a second to like the video only if slow, sacred storytelling is your kind of thing. If it helps your mind settle, if it gives your heart space to breathe, subscribe and tell me, where are you listening from? What time is it for you right now? It always amazes me how far this quiet little space stretches. Now close your eyes and come with me into the heart of ancient Babylon, into stone chambers heavy with fear, and the quiet den where lions waited. But peace remained. The city rose like a crown of stone against the horizon. Walls stretched high, gleaming with carved patterns, gates wide enough for chariots and kings. Babylon, the heart of an empire. The hum of voices, the rattle of chains, the measured march of soldiers, it all pulsed through the streets like a restless current. But beneath the gold, beneath the grandeur, there was grief. Daniel's feet moved slowly across foreign ground, each step pressed into unfamiliar soil. Around him, others walked too, heads lowered, eyes heavy with loss. They were the exiles, the forgotten, the ones plucked from Jerusalem and threaded into Babylon's web of conquest. Their homes, their temple, their songs, left behind. Only memory remained now, fragile and flickering. The air carried the faint scent of cedar and burnt incense. Market stalls lined the wide avenues, merchants shouting in unfamiliar tongues, colors of silk and spices bleeding into the crowded streets. Babylon was alive, loud, layered, untouchable. But for Daniel, it was a fracture in the story he thought he knew. He had been young when they came. Soldiers under banners heavy with arrogance, their chariots grinding into the soft earth of Judah, their commands sharp and unrelenting. The temple fell. The walls crumbled, families scattered like sand beneath storm winds, and Daniel, with a few others, young, strong, learned, was chosen. Taken not for punishment, but for promise. Promise shaped by empire, by assimilation, by erasing the edges of their identity. But Daniel carried something the empire could not touch. It hummed beneath his skin, threaded through his veins like quiet flame. It was not defiance, not loud, sharpened rebellion, but presence. Steady, unseen, unshaken. His God, the God of Israel, had not remained in Jerusalem's rubble. That presence walked with him, even here, beneath foreign skies. The palace gates opened wide, revealing courtyards paved in stone, towering pillars, statues of lions and kings with eyes of cold marble. The young exiles were led through labyrinths of hallways, past shimmering pools and woven tapestries heavy with symbols of gods not their own. Daniel's eyes traced the carvings, wings stretched wide, bearded faces, strange beasts. The gods of Babylon, silent in their grandeur, looming in every corner. But within Daniel, a different story whispered. He remembered the psalms sung in the streets of Jerusalem, the prayers carried softly through his family's home, the stories of Moses, of deliverance, of wilderness turned to promise. They were fragments now, stitched into the quiet spaces of his heart. The officials spoke of training, of knowledge, of reshaping their futures in the mold of Babylon's greatness. New names were given, identities traded like coin. Daniel became Belteshazzar, a title shaped by foreign tongues. But beneath it, his true name remained, hidden, rooted, unshaken. Nights stretched long in the chambers of the young captives. They studied languages, learned the laws of kings, absorbed customs designed to smooth their edges. But Daniel, he carried quiet boundaries within him, lines drawn not by pride, but by trust. He ate little from the king's table, chose simplicity over indulgence, not out of defiance, but devotion. The food, the wine, the gilded offerings, they were symbols of a world trying to swallow him whole. But Daniel remained steady. His hunger fed not by meat and wine, but by something older, something sacred. The others noticed his restraint, his calm, his quiet confidence threaded with humility. Even the guards, hardened by duty, watched him with cautious respect. There was strength in him, not loud, not aggressive, but anchored, the strength of knowing who he was and whose he was. The city roared around him, processions of priests, merchants peddling spices and silk, the chants of idol worship rising in the temple courts. But Daniel moved differently, softly, purposefully. His faith wrapped around him like a mantle, light, invisible, but immovable. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months, and slowly, Daniel's presence wove itself into the heart of the empire, not through power, not through aggression, but through steadfastness. His knowledge grew, his insight deepened, his wisdom set him apart. Yet the ache of exile never fully loosened its grip. At night, he would stand beneath the Babylonian stars, distant, cold, unfamiliar, and whisper the prayers of his people, words of longing, of promise, of quiet hope wrapped in uncertainty. He remembered Jerusalem, not just the stones and streets, but the presence of God that hovered there. And in those whispered prayers, he realized presence was not bound to geography. It followed him here, even into the heart of Babylon. And so, Daniel waited. He listened. He learned. But most of all, he trusted. Trusted that exile was not the end. Trusted that courage could bloom quietly. Trusted that the same God who parted seas, who led through wilderness, who whispered through prophets, was not finished weaving his story. Even here, even among the statues and shadows, Daniel remained steady. And somewhere, beyond the noise of Babylon, destiny waited. A moment would come when faith would face the lions, when quiet courage would echo louder than the roars of kings. But for now, he waited, and he trusted. The halls of the palace gleamed beneath torchlight, golden inlays along the stone, vast columns carved with lions, serpents, and winged beasts watching from every corner. The air smelled of roasted meats, of wine steeped in spices, of power layered in luxury. The king's table stretched endlessly, filled with vessels of bronze and silver, platters heavy with food the exiles had never tasted, wine poured from jugs painted with gods and symbols not their own. It was a feast designed to seduce, to reshape, to make them forget. Daniel sat among the others, young faces marked by the weariness of exile, eyes wide at the opulence. Their journey from Jerusalem's fractured streets had led them here, to the heart of an empire determined to mold them, to soften their convictions with comfort, to erase their belonging with indulgence. The officials spoke softly, but their meaning was clear. Eat, drink, become one of us. And many did, some out of hunger, others from exhaustion, some simply because resistance felt futile within these towering halls where every corner whispered of Babylon's reach. But Daniel, he hesitated. His hands rested on the table's edge, his heart steady beneath the embroidered robes now draped across him, symbols of his new station. His eyes traced the food, the roasted meats, the rich breads, the wine that glistened dark and sweet. It all pulsed with temptation, but beneath the surface, there was a quiet cost. The food, the rituals around it, the unspoken compromises, they were threads woven into Babylon's tapestry of worship. Eating was not simply nourishment, it was assimilation, an invisible surrender. Daniel understood this. His quiet gaze shifted from the table to the unseen places within himself. His name might have changed, his surroundings reshaped, but his faith, his presence, his belonging to the God of Israel remained untouched. So he chose, gently, but firmly. He requested vegetables, water, simplicity. It was not rebellion that stirred in him, but resolve, a quiet, sacred boundary drawn not with arrogance, but with trust. The guards frowned, cautious. Refusal could be seen as defiance, and defiance in Babylon came at a price. But Daniel's presence, the steady calm of his eyes, the quiet humility of his voice, softened the edges of suspicion. "Test us," Daniel offered gently. "For 10 days. See if we lack for strength." The guards, reluctant but intrigued, agreed. And so, while others filled themselves with the king's offerings, Daniel and his companions, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, ate only the earth-simple gifts, the food of fields and streams, untouched by idols or compromise. Each bite became a small act of worship, each sip a reminder. It wasn't about the food, it was about the heart, about remaining set apart, even when the world wrapped itself around them. Days passed, the empire watched, and slowly, something quiet but undeniable took root. Their faces did not pale with hunger. Their eyes did not dim with weakness. They stood steady, their bodies strengthened not by royal indulgence, but by the quiet nourishment of faith, of presence, of choosing integrity over ease. The officials noticed, the guards whispered. Even among the splendor of Babylon, the simple strength of these young men could not be dismissed. The king's table lost its power to entice. And Daniel, he walked the halls with quiet assurance. He did not stand on platforms, did not raise his voice in protest, but his life, his choices, whispered something louder than rebellion. It whispered trust, a sacred confidence that presence walks with us, even through foreign courts and unfamiliar customs. Babylon could dress him in new robes, give him a new name, flood his days with gold and grandeur, but it could not touch the roots planted deep within him. The days stretched onward. Dreams stirred in the palace, unsettling the king. Statues of gods loomed larger, but beneath it all, Daniel remained steady, anchored not to titles or tables, but to the quiet knowing that faith does not yield to fear, that identity, carried gently, can resist even the strongest tides of assimilation. The others began to watch him differently, some with suspicion, others with cautious admiration. His life became a quiet echo of the stories sung back home, the stories of Joseph in Egypt, of Moses before Pharaoh, of prophets who stood firm in the spaces between kingdoms. And though exile had stripped much away, presence remained. The God who whispered across the wilderness, who carved promises into the bones of their ancestors, still walked with them. Even here, even in Babylon. And Daniel, with every small act of obedience, remembered that exile was not erasure, it was preparation for something more, something still unfolding. The halls of Babylon whispered with unease. Stone corridors once steady with the rhythm of sandals and song now pulsed with restless footsteps, with the murmurs of advisors, with the frantic shuffle of diviners clutching their scrolls. A dream had unsettled the king. Not an ordinary dream, the fleeting kind that vanishes with morning light, but a dream heavy with warning, tangled with symbols, sharpened with mystery. Nebuchadnezzar, ruler of this vast empire, had seen visions that lingered long after his eyes opened, and within them, fear, a fear he could not name, but could not shake. He summoned the magicians, the sorcerers, the wise men molded by Babylon's traditions. They came in clusters, draped in robes stitched with symbols of gods carved in stone, eyes wary but eager to please. The king's demand was simple and impossible. Tell me my dream and its meaning. The wise men faltered, their practiced tongues stilled by uncertainty. Interpretation was one thing, but to reach into the shadows of a man's mind, to extract the unspoken, that was beyond them. Their failure thickened the air. The king's patience thinned. A decree fell like stone into water, harsh, unyielding. If the dream cannot be revealed, neither can those who call themselves wise remain. Panic spread, quiet but consuming. Even those not summoned that day, those who carried wisdom shaped by different customs, different gods, felt the edges of fear close in. Daniel heard the whispers. He was still young in the court, his presence quiet but steady, his reputation a thread among the fabric of the empire's rising stories. But when the decree reached him, when the threat shadowed even his companions, Daniel's heart stirred, not with fear, but with resolve. The others may have bowed to despair, but Daniel, he turned to prayer. That night, beneath the vast, unfamiliar sky of Babylon, he knelt. His words did not rise with volume, but with vulnerability. He remembered the stories of his ancestors, the God who revealed mysteries, who guided through shadows, who spoke in the silence. And then, the dream came, not in fragments or riddles, but clear, steady, shaped by presence. Daniel saw the towering statue, the head of gold, the chest of silver, the bronze, the iron, the fragile feet of clay. And he saw the stone, not carved by human hands, but sent. A quiet, unassuming stone that struck the foundation, that crumbled the towering pride of kingdoms, that became a mountain stretching beyond sight. The meaning settled into his chest like quiet certainty. The empires rise, and they fall. But one presence remains, one kingdom, unshaken. The next morning, Daniel approached the commander, the one tasked with executing the king's decree. His voice was steady, his eyes reflecting not arrogance, but peace. "Take me to the king," Daniel asked gently. "I will tell him his dream." The court rippled with skepticism, but Nebuchadnezzar, desperate, curious, allowed it. Daniel stood before him, not with grand robes or polished speeches, but with quiet humility. He spoke not as one filled with personal wisdom, but as one carrying a message entrusted by the divine. "No man can reveal this mystery," Daniel began, "but there is a God in heaven who reveals what is hidden, who speaks through dreams, who holds kingdoms in his hand." And with that, he spoke the dream, the statue, the empires, the fragile feet, the stone not shaped by hands, the rise and fall of earthly power, the enduring presence of the divine. The king's eyes widened, not with anger, but with awe. The interpretation stirred within the court, unsettling the foundations of pride, of assumed control. but it also wove respect for Daniel, for the God he carried quietly within him. Nebuchadnezzar, proud ruler of Babylon, bowed slightly, not in full surrender, but in reluctant reverence. Daniel's name spread, not with loud declarations, but with the quiet ripple of respect. The boy from Jerusalem, exiled and forgotten by many, now held space among the empire's most trusted. He did not chase power, but it came. He did not seek titles, but they followed. Daniel was elevated, not to erase his convictions, but to live them more fully. His companions, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, were lifted too, each woven into the fabric of leadership, carrying the presence of their God into the heart of an empire built on pride. And though Babylon shimmered with its idols, its towering ziggurats, its kings cloaked in arrogance, Daniel remained tethered to something deeper. He remembered the dream, the stone, the foundation, the quiet kingdom that would endure when all others crumbled. And beneath the surface, he knew more trials would come, more tests of courage, more moments when trust must anchor the soul in the den of danger. But for now, he walked with steady peace, carrying the quiet assurance that the God who reveals mysteries is never absent, even here, even in Babylon. The statues loomed along the streets of Babylon, figures carved from stone, gold, and bronze, towering above the crowds like sentinels of pride. Winged beasts with lion bodies and human faces. Gods chiseled in harsh lines, their eyes frozen in hollow command. They watched everything, the merchants, the soldiers, the rulers, the exiles. Daniel walked beneath them often now. His days moved through the palace courts, his name whispered in the halls, his wisdom sought after quietly by those who held power. But outside, the city pulsed with symbols, reminders of an empire convinced of its own greatness. The statues were more than art. They were declarations, monuments to control. They told the people who to fear, who to worship, who reigned. But Daniel, he carried a different allegiance, one unseen by Babylon's stone gods. He moved through the markets with steady eyes, past vendors selling spices, silk, and incense that curled into the air like forgotten prayers. The river, wide and slow, wove through the heart of the city, its waters reflecting the towering ziggurats and gilded rooftops. Babylon was beautiful, but beneath the gold was emptiness. The exiles, his people, lived in the quiet margins, their songs muted, their memories clinging to fragments of home. But Daniel, he remembered. Every step beneath the statues was a step layered with quiet defiance, not through words, but through integrity. He did not shout his faith, did not confront the idol worship with protests or anger. His life was quieter than that. His choices, his steadfast presence, whispered of a different kingdom. In the palace, officials came to know him, not as one easily swayed by luxury or fear, but as one anchored by something unseen. He excelled in his tasks, his insight sharp, his counsel trusted. But Daniel never lost sight of his belonging. The city offered him influence, but not identity. Babylon could give him titles, but not his name. The days turned, and the empire's demands often pressed against his quiet convictions. Festivals that honored false gods, laws shaped by pride, moments where blending in would have been easier. But Daniel, he remained steady. His companions too, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, they stood with him, carrying the same quiet strength that flowed from their shared faith. They prayed together, not in defiant spectacle, but in hidden spaces, their windows open toward Jerusalem, their hearts tethered to promises older than Babylon's foundations. The statues watched, unmoving, but so did God. The palace court shifted around them. New rulers rose, decrees were made, and through it all, Daniel's integrity wove through the cracks of empire. He remembered his ancestors, the stories of Joseph in Egypt, steady beneath Pharaoh's gaze. The legacy of Moses, leading not with might, but with presence. Daniel's own story now joined that thread. An exile, yes, but not abandoned. His reputation grew, not as one corrupted by power, but as one set apart. Officials respected him. Some envied him. His wisdom, drawn not from books alone, but from the quiet counsel of prayer, marked him. Still, beneath the statues, danger simmered. Jealousy brewed in shadowed corners. Whispers twisted through marble halls. The empire admired Daniel's excellence, but many feared his difference. And yet, he did not waver. The stones of Babylon could rise around him, the statues could tower above, but the presence that walked with him, unseen, steady, remained greater. Daniel's feet pressed into foreign soil, but his heart, his identity, his quiet integrity, they belonged to the God who whispers in exile, who anchors in uncertainty, who remains when kingdoms fall. The lions had not yet come. The den still waited, hidden beyond the horizon. But courage, trust, peace, they were already being shaped, beneath the statues, in the silence, in the small, unseen choices of every day. The fires faded, but the empire's pride smoldered still. In the days that followed, Babylon hummed with rumors, the furnace, the unburned captives, the figures seen walking among them untouched by flame. Whispers twisted through the markets, the palace halls, the quiet spaces where servants and soldiers exchanged stories of a God who defied kings and fire alike. Daniel listened, steady as always, his heart anchored to the quiet truth that presence walks with them, even when the world tightens its grip. His companions, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, emerged from the furnace unchanged by the flames but deepened by faith. Their names, once unknown among the empire's masses, now carried weight, not the weight of power, but the quiet gravity of those who refused to bow. But for Daniel, the story was not yet finished. His own trial lingered like a shadow beyond the horizon, its shape still forming. Babylon carried on, its statues untouched, its ziggurats towering, its pride layered in stone and gold. But beneath the surface, jealousy simmered, coiled in the hearts of those unsettled by Daniel's quiet rise. He moved through the palace with the same steady presence, his wisdom sought, his counsel trusted, yet the eyes watching him sharpened, hungry for fault. The empire admired his excellence, but feared his difference. The other officials whispered, their envy hidden behind practiced smiles and polished robes. They could not accuse him of negligence, his work was flawless. They could not question his loyalty to the duties placed upon him. But his faith, his unseen, unwavering devotion to the God of his ancestors, that became their snare. They plotted, not with open confrontation, but with laws sharpened by deceit. A trap crafted in legal ink, designed to test not his competence, but his allegiance to presence over power. The empire's hunger for conformity grew, and Daniel's refusal to be reshaped by it became the quiet center of their envy. But still, he did not waver. His courage was not loud. It moved like the desert wind, soft, constant, unyielding. The fires had proven that presence walks with them through flames. Soon, Daniel would learn that same presence waits in the shadows of lions, and even then, peace would remain. The walls of the palace stood tall, heavy with the weight of history and pride, their smooth stone faces carved with patterns of lions, winged creatures, and symbols that declared Babylon's greatness to anyone who dared question it. Yet beneath all that grandeur, beneath the polished floors and the golden rooftops that caught the sun like crowns of flame, there was a quiet current moving unnoticed by most, a thread woven not by empire but by integrity, and at the center of it stood Daniel, not in defiance, but in quiet presence, trusted by kings, yet never owned by them. His rise to influence unfolding not through loud declarations or forceful ambition, but through steady, unwavering faith. It began slowly, first in the small tasks assigned to him, the handling of records, the management of officials, the deciphering of ancient laws and courtly customs that bound the empire together like threads in a vast, complicated tapestry. Others may have chased promotion through flattery, through scheming, through aligning themselves with the shifting tides of Babylonian politics. But Daniel moved differently, his strength not in manipulation, but in his steadfastness. He carried himself with a calm that unsettled the powerful and comforted the weary. His words chosen with care, his silences even more precise in the beginning. Many underestimated him, seeing only an exile, a young man far from his homeland, dressed in the garments of the empire, but marked by the unseen fingerprints of his God. But as the years wove onward, his wisdom became undeniable, his counsel sought after by those even in the highest places. And yet, with every new appointment, every new layer of influence, Daniel never loosened his grip on the quiet, sacred boundaries that anchored him. He refused the indulgent feasts, the rituals to foreign gods, the compromises that came wrapped in gold. And still, he thrived, his excellence undeniable, his insight sharp, his understanding of laws and visions respected by all, even as those around him bristled at his difference. For in the empire of Babylon, conformity was currency. Yet Daniel's currency came from elsewhere, from the quiet presence that walked with him even when the city roared with pride. The kings noticed. Nebuchadnezzar himself had marveled at Daniel's ability to untangle the threads of his dreams, to reveal what no sorcerer or diviner could grasp. And though the king's heart often wrestled with pride and fear, he could not deny that Daniel's God carried a weight that eclipsed even Babylon's might. When Nebuchadnezzar fell, when the empire shifted and new rulers claimed the throne, Daniel remained, his influence not tied to one man's favor, but to the steady, visible fruit of his integrity. And so the pattern repeated. Kings came and went, officials rose and fell, yet Daniel endured, his counsel trusted, his presence a quiet constant in the ever-turning machinery of empire. It was not without cost. Jealousy simmered in the corners of the court, whispers threading through marble hallways. The other advisors watched him with narrowed eyes, their envy sharp, their patience thin. They could not accuse him of incompetence. His work was flawless. They could not find fault in his service. His records clean, his judgments fair. And so their eyes turned to the one place they knew never compromise, his faith, his quiet, unshakable allegiance to the God of his ancestors. They studied his routines, his prayers whispered toward Jerusalem, the steady rhythm of his life woven with scripture and song, even in the heart of exile. And they plotted their plan not shaped by swords or armies, but by ink and law, crafting a trap they believed even Daniel could not escape. Yet through it all, Daniel moved with the same peace, the same courage, unshaken by the storm forming beneath him. His rise to influence never about status, never about titles, but about trust, a trust that threaded through kings and crises alike, his name spoken in courts, his wisdom carried beyond Babylon's walls. And yet his heart remained anchored not to the empire, but to the quiet, unseen presence that had never left him. The lions were coming, the den prepared, but Daniel's peace was already in place, and even in the shadow of danger, he remained steady, trusted by kings, but defined by faith. The chambers of the palace were heavy with the weight of old stone, the floors cool beneath Daniel's feet, as he moved through the maze of marble halls and vaulted ceilings that echoed with the footsteps of kings and the quiet stirrings of empire. And in those walls, hidden beyond the golden statues and towering ziggurats, there were scrolls, faded, delicate, inked with prophecies older than Babylon itself, prophecies carried by wanderers and whispered across generations, their words layered with mystery, with warning, with the quiet thread of hope for those willing to listen. And Daniel. He listened, his fingers tracing the edges of the scrolls, his eyes steady beneath the flickering torchlight as the words unfolded, reminders of kingdoms that rose and crumbled, of empires that declared themselves eternal yet withered beneath the hand of the unseen. And among those brittle parchments, Daniel found not just history, but purpose, the weight of prophecy resting on him not as a burden, but as a quiet invitation to trust the presence that carried him through exile and uncertainty alike. The officials came and went, their footsteps brisk with duty, their voices laced with arrogance or fear, but Daniel remained steady, his heart anchored to the truths whispered across the parchment fibers, truths that spoke of a God who reveals mysteries, who shapes kings and humbles nations, who speaks softly yet shakes the foundations of pride. And as the empire grew restless with its own ambitions, as kings dreamed dreams that unsettled the court, Daniel's understanding deepened, not through power, but through patience, his knowledge of prophecy woven not from ambition, but from years spent in quiet trust. The scrolls spoke of the stone uncut by human hands, of the mountain that would rise when the empires fell. They whispered of trials yet to come, of danger hidden in plain sight, of lions and dens and silent tests of courage. And though the weight of those revelations pressed against him, Daniel did not waver. He carried the secrets of prophecy with reverence, his days marked by excellence in service, his nights spent in prayer beneath the vast Babylonian sky, his window open toward the distant hills of Jerusalem, the city left behind yet never abandoned in his heart. And the officials noticed, their envy simmering beneath the surface, their plans sharpened with legal ink and hidden ambition. They feared what they could not control. And Daniel, they could not control, his presence unshaken by their schemes, his wisdom respected even by those who plotted his downfall. And as the scrolls whispered of future kings, of kingdoms like silver, bronze, and iron, Daniel understood that power is fleeting, that the presence guiding him was stronger than empires carved from stone. The weight of prophecy was not fear, but promise, and with every passing day, as the court twisted with pride, as the den of lions waited unseen beyond the horizon, Daniel stood steady, anchored to words written long before his exile, trusting not in his own strength, but in the quiet assurance that presence goes with those who remain faithful, even in the shadows of danger, even when the world plots their silence. The city hummed with the restless rhythm of empire, merchants calling out beneath sun-bleached awnings, guards pacing along the outer walls with their spears catching the light, scribes hunched over tablets etched with laws that bound every citizen, every exile, every servant and noble alike beneath the weight of Babylon's command. And within that intricate web of control, a single law now coiled tighter than the others, sealed with the king's ring, carved into stone with the pretense of unity, but crafted with the quiet poison of envy, a law that could not be bent, could not be undone, could not be softened, even by the will of the king himself, once his signet pressed into the clay. The officials had known this, their plan layered with precision, their words sharpened with the hidden intent to corner Daniel not with swords, but with legality, to make his devotion his downfall. And the king, caught between pride and politics, had listened, his judgment clouded by their flattery, his vision narrowed by the false promise of loyalty wrapped in law. For 30 days, no man would pray to God or ruler but to him, Darius, king of the empire, and the people, many unaware of the undercurrents beneath the decree, obeyed, their fear of consequence heavier than their convictions. Yet Daniel stood apart, not in rebellion shaped by anger, but in the same quiet, anchored presence that had guided him from the moment exile carried him into Babylon's gates. The law may have been sealed, but so was his trust, so was his peace. The window of his chambers remained open, the same familiar breeze curling through the fabric, the faint hum of the city below unchanged. And there, facing Jerusalem, facing the distant hills and the temple ruins etched into his memory, Daniel knelt, his voice rising not with defiance but with intimacy, his prayers woven with longing and gratitude alike. For he knew the trap had been set, knew the jealous eyes watched from the shadows. Yet his routine did not falter. His devotion did not fracture beneath the empire's demands. They came for him swiftly, the officials slipping into his chambers under the pretense of duty, their footsteps measured, their faces adorned with false authority, and they found him as they expected, kneeling, praying, unchanged, their accusations sharpened with practiced satisfaction as they dragged him before the king, reciting the law with cold precision, reminding Darius of the decree that could not be undone. The king's face fell, his pride unraveling into regret, for he saw the snare too late, saw the trap for what it was, not justice, but jealousy made manifest in law. Yet the empire's rules held even the king captive, and though his heart wrestled, though his spirit mourned, he could not free Daniel from the consequence carved into stone. The law that could not bend now bent the king himself, twisting his authority into helplessness. The den was prepared, the lions restless behind their heavy gates, their roars rumbling like distant thunder. And Daniel remained steady, his eyes calm beneath the weight of accusation, his peace unwavering even as the shadows of the den stretched toward him. For he knew presence does not fracture under pressure. It deepens, it anchors, it remains. And even as the empire closed in, as the law sealed his fate with ink and pride, Daniel trusted that the same hand that shut the mouths of kings could still shut the mouths of lions. The law could not bend, but neither could his faith. Neither could the quiet, sacred courage carried within him, unshaken, unseen by the roaring world beyond. The city pulsed with whispers as the law echoed through the streets, spoken by merchants beneath woven canopies, murmured by soldiers along the gates, tangled in the conversations of nobles cloaked in silk and suspicion. And though the words were cloaked in reverence, in loyalty to the king, beneath them lay the quiet poison of deceit, the decree that no man shall pray to God or ruler but Darius himself. 30 days of silence forced upon faith, a law sharpened by jealousy and sealed by pride. And yet, in the heart of the city, tucked within the upper chambers of stone that overlooked the bustling streets, Daniel's window remained open, its frame worn smooth by the hands of time, its curtains pulled gently aside to welcome the familiar breeze, to face the distant hills beyond the walls, the hills where Jerusalem once stood proud, where the temple's songs once rose like incense into the sky. And though the city of his ancestors was far, fractured beneath the hands of conquering armies, its memory lived steady within him, carried like a quiet ember through the wilderness of exile. And so, as the city watched, as the officials crept in the shadows, their envy threaded into every glance. Daniel knelt by the window, his face turned toward the forgotten hills, his heart anchored to the promises etched into generations, his prayers steady, soft, unshaken. For his faith was not bound by the empire's borders, nor silenced by the threats of men. His devotion ran deeper than decrees, older than the stones beneath Babylon's streets. The city may have forgotten the presence that shapes nations, but Daniel had not. His voice lifted, not in rebellion, but in trust, a quiet conversation with the divine that no law could touch. The sound of footsteps gathered below, their rhythm hurried, heavy with the weight of accusation, the officials arriving as they had planned, their eyes bright with satisfaction, their whispers curling like smoke into the upper chambers. They had expected fear, perhaps defiance shaped by desperation. But what they found instead was peace. Daniel, steady as ever, praying as he always had, his window open not in arrogance, but in remembrance, in belonging to the God who walks with his people even in exile, even when the world conspires to silence them. The officials seized upon the moment, their accusations layered with false righteousness as they carried their proof to the king, their trap sprung, the decree unbending. And though Darius's heart faltered, his regret tangled in the snare of his own pride, the law stood, unyielding. Yet Daniel did not protest, did not bargain. His peace held firm, for the window was more than wood and stone. It was a threshold, a quiet place where presence met exile, where faith stretched beyond borders, beyond threats, beyond the pride of kings. The watching world may have seen defiance, but Daniel's God saw trust, saw courage wrapped in stillness. The city hummed with anticipation as the officials declared their victory. The lions stirred behind their gates, their roars low and unsettling. But Daniel's window remained open, and so did his heart, so did his trust. The world could watch, could conspire, could condemn, but the quiet presence remained, unseen by the roaring crowds, but nearer than breath, nearer than fear. And even as the city closed in, Daniel's prayers continued, steady, unwavering, his voice a quiet thread stretching across the miles, across the laws, across the watching world, unbroken. The sun dipped lower across the stone rooftops of Babylon, the market still bustling with the clatter of merchants, the streets humming with voices layered in pride and fear. But within the heart of the palace, the quiet snare that had been woven so carefully began to tighten. Daniel's prayer, offered not in defiance but in steady ancient trust, now twisted by the jealous into the very charge they had longed to wield. Their whispers sharpened into accusation, their envy clothed in the polished language of loyalty to the king. The officials moved quickly, their sandals striking the polished floors with rehearsed precision, their faces set with the satisfaction of ambition fulfilled. They carried the weight of the law with them, not as servants of justice, but as architects of Daniel's undoing. And as they approached his chambers, as they climbed the steps that led to the open window where the breeze carried the faint echoes of his whispered prayers, they did not find a man cowering in fear, nor one hiding in shadows. They found Daniel exactly as they expected, exactly as he had always been, kneeling in the fading light, his face turned toward the distant hills of Jerusalem, his voice low and calm, speaking to the God who had shaped his steps through exile, through rise to influence, through the quiet tests of loyalty that no empire could see but every heart carried. The officials seized upon the moment, their words coiling into the air like smoke. their accusations swift and rehearsed. They declared his guilt with the gleam of triumph in their eyes, dragging him through the streets with the confidence of those who believed power belonged only to those who conformed, only to those who bowed not to presence but to pride. The people watched, their voices hushed with curiosity and unease. Some remembered Daniel's counsel, his steady wisdom that had guided kings and steadied courts. Others whispered of the law, of the lions waiting beyond the stone walls, of justice cloaked in envy, of faith mistaken for defiance. But Daniel remained steady, his steps firm beneath him, his heart tethered to something greater than the roaring of crowds or the weight of consequence. The palace loomed as they entered, its pillars gleaming beneath torchlight, the king seated upon his throne, his face heavy with the realization of the trap now sprung. His advisors spoke first, their words laced with practiced loyalty, reminding Darius of the decree he himself had sealed, of the law that could not bend, of the punishment now demanded, the den, the lions, the silent end they had orchestrated. The king's eyes faltered as they rested upon Daniel, regret threading into his expression. For he had trusted this man, respected him, leaned upon his wisdom in the quiet corridors of power. And now, bound by the laws crafted to ensnare, he watched as consequence unfolded. Daniel's face remained calm, his shoulders steady. There were no pleas for mercy, no protests, only the quiet peace of one whose life had never been shaped by empire's approval, but by the presence that threads through shadows and silence alike. Darius wrestled with the weight of the law, his commands bound by pride, his regret deepening with every moment. But the officials pressed him, their trap tightened, the decree irreversible, the den inevitable. And so, beneath the watching eyes of the court, Daniel was led away, his steps echoing against the marble, his heart unmoved by the shifting of circumstance. The city hummed with anticipation. The lions stirred behind the iron gates. The officials whispered of victory, of the empire's pride preserved. But Daniel's trust held firm, for the God who had walked with him through exile, through influence, through the fires faced by his companions, now walked with him into the den, into the heart of consequence. And even as the shadows deepened, as the gates prepared to close, his peace remained, his courage quiet but unshaken, his prayers rising, unseen, unwavering. A thread that no law could cut, no pride could unravel. The consequence may have arrived, but so had presence, steady, near, unbroken. The sun sank low across the Babylonian skyline, its golden light fading into shadows that stretched across the palace walls, the streets narrowing beneath the weight of dusk. Yet within the heart of the empire, the halls of power remained alive with voices, with the quiet ripple of consequence now set in motion. The law sealed, the den prepared, the trap sprung, and King Darius sat heavy upon his throne. The carved lions flanking him now felt more like warnings than symbols of authority, his hands restless upon the stone armrests, his gaze fixed upon the marble floors as the echoes of his own decree twisted around him. Sharper than any sword, heavier than any crown, regret pressed into him like an unseen hand, for he saw the snare too late, saw the quiet deception woven into the words of his officials, their false reverence, their veiled ambitions. They had wrapped their envy in loyalty, concealed their trap beneath the silk of flattery. And Darius, proud, eager to steady the empire beneath his reign, had listened, had pressed his signet into the clay, had bound the law into permanence, never imagining that its weight would fall upon the very man he trusted most. Daniel, the exile-turned advisor, the quiet presence in the court, whose wisdom had steadied kings, whose integrity had never faltered beneath the tides of politics and pride. now condemned not by crime but by conviction. The king's mind churned with possibilities, his advisors circling him like vultures disguised in silk, their eyes gleaming with satisfaction, their words polished with practiced concern. Yet beneath it all, they waited for him to surrender, to concede that the law must hold, that Daniel's fate was sealed. But Darius wrestled within himself, pacing the stone floors long after the court emptied, his sandals whispering against the marble as torches flickered along the walls. The lions roared faintly in the distance, their hunger a low hum beneath the night's silence. And yet, louder still was the voice in his heart. The regret coiled tight within him, for he had admired Daniel's steadiness, his refusal to bow to arrogance, his courage threaded with humility, his loyalty not to thrones but to truth. And now, bound by his own hand, Darius watched as the man who had carried wisdom through the shifting sands of empire was led toward the den. The officials smirked behind their polished faces, their jealousy hidden beneath layers of false propriety. But the king saw through them now, his regret sharpening into quiet frustration, his power revealed as fragile beneath the weight of his own decree. He approached Daniel as they prepared the gates of the den, the torches casting flickering shadows across the stone, the lions pacing within, their roars rising, their presence undeniable. And Darius, his voice low, his expression weary, spoke not as a ruler, but as a man desperate to believe. "May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you." The words were laced with more than duty. They were laced with the ache of hope, with the quiet recognition that presence could go where politics could not, that faith might yet reach beyond the stone walls and iron gates. Daniel met his gaze with calm, his eyes steady, his peace unwavering even as the shadows closed in. And Darius felt the weight of his own helplessness press deeper. The den's mouth opened, the officials eager to fulfill their scheme, their ambition cloaked as justice. And Daniel was lowered into the darkness, the lions shifting, their forms massive, their teeth gleaming beneath torchlight. Yet Daniel did not tremble, his trust anchored, his spirit cradled by the quiet knowing that presence had not left him. Even now, even here, the stone was rolled into place, sealing the den, sealing the trap, and the king. The king withdrew, his shoulders heavy, his heart restless, his regret tangled into every breath. That night, Darius did not sleep, his bed untouched, his servants dismissed. The palace felt hollow, its grandeur muted beneath the weight of his mistake. His thoughts churned like storm clouds, his ears straining for some sign, some whisper that all was not lost. And as the night stretched long, as the lions stirred unseen behind the sealed stone, Darius waited, regret pressing upon him, the consequences of pride and law unbending. But beyond the weight of his failure, a fragile hope remained, that presence had gone where he could not, that Daniel's God was near, even now, even in the den. The night fell heavier than most, the stars veiled behind the drifting clouds that pressed across the sky, like curtains drawn over the anxious hush of the empire. Babylon's walls towering silent against the horizon, their edges blurred by the darkness that crept along the stone. And within those walls, the den waited, carved deep beneath the earth, its entrance wide and unforgiving, the shadows within curling thick with anticipation, the lions restless in their pacing, their low growls vibrating along the stone, their forms large, their teeth glinting in the flickering torchlight. And beyond the torches, the officials gathered, their faces layered in satisfaction, their ambitions fulfilled beneath the thin veil of law. They stood with their polished robes and sharpened words, their victory sealed not by armies, but by envy, by deception, by the irreversible decree that had ensnared Daniel's unwavering devotion. Yet amid their smirks and their quiet pride, Daniel stood calm, his eyes steady as they led him forward, his feet pressing lightly into the sand and stone, each step unshaken by the murmurs of the crowd, by the rumble of the lions beyond, for he knew the presence that walked with him into exile, that steadied him through the court, that guided his counsel through the labyrinth of empire, would not falter now. Not here, the officials whispered, their jealousy hidden beneath carefully crafted concern, their trap perfected. Yet Daniel's spirit did not fracture. His peace remained intact. Darius, heavy with regret, his crown weighted more by failure than by gold, followed the procession in silence, his heart gripped by helplessness, his steps uncertain. For he had bound himself with law, sealed Daniel's fate with his own signet. Yet in his eyes lingered a fragile hope, the desperate belief that perhaps the God Daniel trusted, the presence that Daniel carried quietly through the halls of power, could yet intervene. The den's mouth loomed wide as they arrived, the torches casting long shadows along the rough-hewn walls. The lions stirred, their movement slow, their eyes gleaming with hunger sharpened by confinement. And yet Daniel did not waver, his face calm beneath the faint glow of torchlight, his prayers rising like whispers threaded through the heavy air. The officials, impatient, gestured for the stone to be moved, its surface broad and ancient, its weight symbolic as much as it was physical. Darius's voice cracked the silence as the guards prepared to seal the den, his words layered with quiet desperation more than command. May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you. The officials exchanged glances, their smirks sharpening, their confidence settled. But Daniel's gaze did not shift, his heart anchored not to the frailty of kings, nor to the schemes of men, but to the quiet, unwavering presence that had steadied him through every trial. The guards moved with practiced ease, their muscles straining as they rolled the great stone across the den's mouth, its grinding weight pressing into the earth as it sealed the darkness beyond. The lions unseen now, their roars muffled by stone and distance. The silence that followed wrapped around the courtyard like a heavy veil. Darius lingered, his expression fractured by regret, his steps faltering as the officials offered final words layered with false respect. But the king did not hear them, his mind consumed by the weight of his decree, by the fragile hope that presence had gone where he could not, that Daniel's faith, so quiet, so constant, would not yield even beneath the jaws of beasts. The officials dispersed, their roles performed, their ambitions fulfilled, the den sealed, Daniel enclosed within the shadows, yet beyond the reach of fear, for his peace was not tethered to light or freedom, but to the God who shaped the stones beneath him, who held the breath of lions in his hand. The hours stretched long into the night, the stone unmoving, the empire hushed beneath the veil of consequence. And within the den, amidst the darkness, amidst the quiet padding of the lion's heavy steps, amidst the low growls that rumbled like distant thunder, Daniel remained, his spirit anchored, his prayers rising into the unseen, his trust steady as the stone itself. The mouth of the den closed tight, but the presence had not left him. It never had. It never would. The darkness pressed heavy within the den. A vast hush settled over the stone walls, the air thick with the musk of lions and the faint, earthy scent of sand and fur, their forms shifting just beyond the reach of faint torchlight that leaked briefly through the crevices high along the den's jagged ceiling. The lions pacing, their movements slow, deliberate, muscle rippling beneath their thick manes, eyes gleaming with the sharp edge of hunger dulled by the stillness that suddenly clung to the space. Daniel stood, his breath steady though the shadows coiled thick around him, his heart anchored not to the ground beneath his feet, not to the stone walls that rose high above, but to the quiet, unseen presence that had walked with him every step from exile to this moment. The roars of the lions softened, a low hum threading through the chamber like distant thunder rolling across forgotten hills, their massive forms circling. Yet they did not strike, did not lunge, their teeth glinting faint in the darkness, but their hunger restrained by something deeper, something invisible that moved through the shadows with more weight than fear. Daniel's eyes adjusted slowly, the faint outlines of the lions sharpening as they shifted, their paws pressing into the dust, their breath warm in the cool, cavernous space. Yet within him, peace pulsed steady, unwavering, for he knew presence was here, not removed by stone or decree, not silenced by schemes or envy, but here, close, nearer than the very breath that curled from his lips in the chilled air of the den. The hours stretched long, the night deepened, yet fear never found him. His body pressed gently against the stone walls, his prayers steady, whispered, woven softly through the growls and the echoing rustle of fur and claw. The lions, mighty, created in strength and majesty, yet calmed by the hand unseen, the same hand that shaped rivers through the wilderness, that steadied his heart beneath foreign skies, that carried him from fields of exile into the courts of kings, now cradled him here, in the den, in the darkness, in the quiet space between consequence and deliverance. Daniel's spirit held firm, his peace untangled from circumstance. The lion's eyes gleamed in the faintest shafts of moonlight filtering down through the cracks in the stone above. Yet they did not advance. Their movements slowed, their roars softened to little more than breath upon the air, their massive forms settling along the cool earth, paws curled beneath them, their great chests rising and falling with each steady breath. And Daniel, still unshaken, his prayers rising softly, steady as the stars hidden beyond the stone ceiling. Presence filled the den, an unseen comfort weaving through the bones of the earth, threading peace into the deepest spaces where shadows once ruled. The officials beyond the walls believed the den would silence him. The lions would consume what they could not control, but they had underestimated the quiet strength of trust, the peace that cannot fracture beneath fear, the presence that remains unbroken even in the mouth of danger. The night stretched long, the hours unfolded slow and heavy, but within the darkness, no claws found him, no teeth tore through him. Only the steady hum of divine stillness layered itself into the silence. The lions at rest, their mighty forms subdued not by chains, but by the quiet authority of the unseen. Daniel's eyes closed for a moment, his prayers still threading softly from his lips, his body unbroken, his spirit unwavering. And even as the empire slept, as the palace floors cooled beneath the night's hush, as regret curled in the heart of the king pacing alone, within the den, peace reigned, unthreatened, unshaken. And though the stone at the entrance sealed him in, though the darkness pressed heavy, and the world beyond believed his fate was certain, Daniel remained, alive, protected, carried not by strength of flesh, but by the hand that shaped lions, that commanded kingdoms, that holds the breath of all who walk the earth. The den, once prepared as a tomb, now cradled a quiet sanctuary where divine peace overshadowed danger, where trust replaced trembling, where presence whispered steady through the shadows, nearer than fear, deeper than darkness, unbroken by the roaring of lions or the plotting of men. The horizon softened as the first threads of dawn stretched quietly across the sky, the stars fading one by one into the light, as the deep indigo veil of night peeled back from the edges of Babylon's towering walls. The city roused from its uneasy sleep, merchants stirring beneath woven awnings, guards shifting along their posts. Yet in the palace, the halls remained still, the torches dimming, the marble floors cool beneath hurried footsteps as King Darius moved, his heart pressed tight with a weight of regret that had clung to him through the longest night, his sandals whispering across the smooth stone, his robes trailing behind him, forgotten in their elegance. For his mind could not settle, his spirit restless beneath the ache of helplessness. He had sealed the den, had spoken the decree, had bound Daniel's fate within the stone walls meant to devour. And yet, through the sleepless hours, his thoughts had circled the same fragile hope, the quiet, unwavering faith of the man he had condemned. The presence Daniel carried like breath, like an unseen shield wrapped around him. Even as the lion stirred in the shadows, the king's hands shook slightly as he pressed through the palace gates, the cool morning breeze threading through the streets, the faintest light of dawn curling along the edges of the towering stone structures, his guards trailing behind him, their eyes cast low, uncertain, for they too had heard the murmurs of the court, the traps set by jealous officials, the quiet strength of the man thrown into the den. And now, as the empire awoke, the king's footsteps carried him toward the den's sealed mouth, the great stone still in place, its surface cool with morning dew, the earth silent beneath their approach, the lions quiet beyond the stone, their roars absent, their power unseen. Darius moved closer, his heart thundering with the fragile anticipation that perhaps, impossibly, the god Daniel served. The presence he spoke to, the presence that steadied him through courts and danger alike, had remained near, had intervened. The officials lingered in the distance, their eyes narrowed, their confidence thinly veiled behind false expressions of concern. Yet their jealousy pulsed beneath their words, beneath their pride. The king gestured sharply, his voice low but layered with both desperation and fragile belief. "Remove the stone." The guards hesitated, their eyes shifting. Yet the command stood, and so they pressed against the great rock, their muscles straining as it rolled aside, the grinding of stone against stone breaking the heavy hush of morning. And as the den opened, the faintest breath of cool air drifted upward, the darkness within stretching wide. And from that darkness, a voice rose, steady, calm, familiar. "O King, live forever." Daniel's words threaded upward, unwavering, unbroken, and Darius's breath caught in his chest, his eyes widening as the impossible settled upon him. Daniel, alive, untouched, his voice anchored not in trembling fear, but in peace, in quiet triumph. That presence had remained, had carried him through the den, through the shadows, through the pacing of lions whose forms had prowled but never struck. The king's shoulders sagged with relief, his heart trembling with the quiet awe of what his eyes now witnessed. The officials faltered, their confidence cracking, their schemes unraveling beneath the weight of proof. For Daniel emerged, steady upon his feet, his robes unmarked, his body untouched, his spirit unbroken, the lions lingering behind him, their great forms curled along the stone, subdued not by chains, but by the unseen hand that holds even the fiercest beasts within its command. Darius approached, his voice layered with wonder, with reverence. "The God you serve continually has rescued you." Daniel's eyes reflected the morning light, his peace unshaken, his prayers answered not with grand spectacle, but with quiet, steady deliverance threaded through the longest night. The stone rolled away, the shadows peeled back, and with the breaking of morning came the quiet proof that presence endures, that faith remains, that the dens of danger do not define the story of those who trust the unseen hand that shapes kings and creatures alike. The city stirred, the news rippling outward, the officials silent now beneath the weight of their exposed envy, their plans fractured, their pride unraveling as the empire bore witness to the quiet triumph of courage wrapped in peace. The stone rolled aside, the morning breaking wide, and Daniel, unchanged, unbroken, carried by the same presence that had steadied him all along. The city of Babylon awoke with the hum of voices rising like low smoke above the rooftops, the markets unfurling their canopies of woven fabrics, the streets filling with the steady shuffle of merchants and soldiers. Yet beneath the ordinary rhythm of empire, a different sound threaded through the crowds, quieter at first, layered in whispers that passed from guard to servant, from merchant to noble. Words that carried not the weight of rebellion nor the noise of spectacle, but the quiet, steady hum of astonishment. Daniel had survived, the den sealed by law, the lions left restless in the shadows, yet untouched, and with the sun rising higher, casting long beams of pale gold across the stone towers. The news stretched outward, rippling through the empire, and at the heart of it, King Darius stood, his hands no longer trembling with helplessness, but anchored by the fragile ore blooming beneath his ribs. For the impossible had unfolded before him. The god Daniel served continually. The presence Daniel carried in silence, the quiet thread of faith that never fractured beneath decree or threat, had reached beyond the stone, beyond the plotting of jealous men, beyond the jaws of beasts, and held him, untouched, steady. The king exhaled a breath that had been coiled in his chest for what felt like endless hours, his shoulders sagging as the weight of regret softened, replaced now with a different burden, one not forged by failure, but by revelation. He had seen pride falter. He had seen the schemes of his officials crumble beneath their own ambition. But most of all, he had seen the quiet, sacred endurance of presence unfold beneath his reign. And now, with Daniel alive, whole, unshaken, the king's heart shifted, his fear of loss unwound into reverence, the recognition of a power that no crown could command, no law could contain, no empire could overshadow. Darius approached the officials, his eyes sharp beneath the morning light, his voice layered not in anger alone, but in disappointment, shaped by the sting of their deception. They had twisted the law, used his authority as a snare, their pride hidden beneath false loyalty, but their scheme, unraveling now beneath the weight of Daniel's survival, could not remain unaddressed. Justice would unfold, their envy exposed, their deception laid bare. Yet before consequence fell upon them, the king turned his gaze to Daniel, to the quiet presence standing among the remnants of fear, his robes untouched, his face calm, his spirit steady beneath the weight of what had transpired. And Darius spoke, his words threaded with awe, with reverence. The God you serve continually, he has rescued you. Daniel's eyes met the king's, not with pride, but with peace, his trust unbroken, his heart anchored to the same quiet thread of presence that had carried him through exile, through the courts of kings, through the den of lions, through the darkest hours of night. The king turned then, his voice rising not in decree alone, but in declaration. Let all the people of the empire know, let it be written, let it be spoken from the highest towers to the lowest corners of the land. The God of Daniel is not confined by walls, not silenced by laws, not restrained by the roaring of beasts. His kingdom will endure. His presence cannot be fractured by the pride of men. And so, the proclamation stretched wide, the empire listening, the reverence threading through every word. Daniel's survival not a spectacle of strength, but a quiet, undeniable reminder that faith, when anchored to the divine, endures, that presence walks with those who trust, that even fear, turned upon itself, can unravel into reverence. The lions silenced, the den opened, the king's regret transformed, the officials silent now beneath the weight of their unraveling ambition, and Daniel, unchanged by the trial, remained steady, his trust unwavering, his peace unshaken, the empire humbled beneath the quiet sacred witness of a man who knelt, who trusted, who walked through the den, and came forth not by might, but by the hand of the God who never left him. The streets of Babylon shifted beneath the weight of the morning, the golden haze of sunrise filtering through latticed windows, the stone towers gleaming faintly as merchants called out along crowded avenues, their voices threading through the hum of a city slowly unraveling its routines. Yet beneath the surface, the hum of curiosity remained. Quiet ripples of whispers winding between pillars and through the palace halls, as the truth of what had unfolded beneath the empire's proud facade continued to stretch outward. Daniel had survived. The lions, subdued by an unseen hand, had not touched him. Their great forms curled along the cool stone of the den, their claws sheathed, their teeth quieted by the authority of a presence greater than instinct, greater than the schemes of men, greater than the fragile arrogance of those who had plotted his downfall. And now, beneath the brightening sky, the officials who had wove the snare found themselves entangled in the unraveling of their own deception. Their faces pale beneath polished robes, their false reverence stripped away by the weight of their exposed envy. They had believed the trap flawless, the law sealed, the den certain, and yet their plan fractured beneath the proof of Daniel's survival, and justice, slow but steady, turned its gaze upon them. Darius, his heart settled now, not in regret, but in reverence, his eyes sharpened by the sting of their betrayal, called them forward, their footsteps faltering as they approached. The smirks that once lingered upon their faces dissolved into quiet dread. They had woven the law with precision. They had layered their pride beneath the thin veil of loyalty. But the God Daniel served, the presence carried quietly through the court, had turned their scheme to dust, their ambition crumbling beneath the weight of what they could not control. The lions, subdued by the divine, now waited, their great forms steady behind the dense stone walls. The officials stood trembling before the king, their words faltering beneath the heavy silence, and justice, as inevitable as dawn, unfolded upon them. Their families, drawn into the consequence of their schemes, their pride now reaping the very fate they had prepared for another. The stone rolled away once more, the lions stirring as the officials were led forward, their cries sharp, but their pleas silenced by the roaring truth that what they had crafted for Daniel now returned to them. The den received them, and the lions, their restraint lifted, their hunger no longer stayed by the unseen hand, moved swiftly, their power unleashed not in vengeance, but in the quiet, inevitable rhythm of justice, turning upon those who believed they could manipulate thrones and deceive kings without consequence. The roars echoed against the stone, the den's mouth sealed again, but the lesson stretched beyond its shadows. The empire watched, its people quiet with awe, with fear, with the humbling recognition that presence threads through the cracks of power, that schemes unraveled by the divine cannot stand. And Daniel, steady, his spirit untouched by pride, his peace still anchored beneath the fragile roar of empire, remained. The officials gone, their deception silenced, their ambition devoured not by beasts alone, but by the justice that always unfolds when pride reaches too far. The city of Babylon hummed once more, its towers gleaming beneath the rising sun, but within the palace, within the hearts of those who witnessed, the story of the den lingered, the quiet, unshaken strength of faith prevailing where schemes faltered, the justice of the unseen hand that remains near, even when the world plots in shadows, even when pride believes itself victorious, and Daniel, unchanged, carried that peace, that presence forward, untouched by fear, steady as the stones beneath his feet. The morning stretched wide across the empire, the faintest clouds drifting like softened brushstrokes across the pale blue sky, the towers of Babylon gleaming beneath the steady warmth of the sun, their sharp edges casting long shadows upon the streets that curled through the heart of the city like veins of stone and dust. And among those streets, the people moved with quiet reverence now, their footsteps lighter, their voices threaded with awe as the story of the den, the survival of Daniel, untouched, unwavering, wove itself through the markets, through the palace halls, through the corners of the empire that once believed power alone could silence faith, but now understood that presence cannot be fractured by decree, nor consumed by beasts, nor silenced by the schemes of men. And within the palace, the chambers that had once held only the hum of politics and pride now carried something else. A quiet song, not of melodies plucked upon lyres nor performed for crowds, but a song of survival, of steady courage that had unfolded not in spectacle, but in stillness. Daniel moved through the halls as he always had, his steps unhurried, his presence unchanged. Yet those who watched him now did so with widened eyes, with softened expressions layered with the fragile awe of those who have witnessed the impossible and cannot help but carry its weight. The officials who once whispered in shadows, their schemes sharpened by envy, were gone, their plans unraveled by justice, their pride silenced by consequence. And the king, Darius, moved differently now too, his crown lighter, his heart tethered no longer to the fragile pride of empire, but to the quiet reverence for the God who had intervened, who had revealed his presence in the most impossible place, who had silenced the jaws of lions and steadied the spirit of the man condemned by decree, but untouched by fear. The proclamation echoed wide, Darius's words carried by scribes, etched upon stone, spoken across the furthest stretches of the land, declaring not the empire's strength, but the endurance of the kingdom unseen. The God of Daniel, steadfast, unshaken, his dominion eternal, his presence enduring, his deliverance undeniable. And as those words threaded through the empire, Daniel's own heart remained anchored not to recognition, not to titles layered upon him by kings, but to the quiet song of survival that hummed within him. A melody shaped not by triumph alone, but by the steady rhythm of trust that had carried him from exile to influence, from fields of his homeland to the chambers of power, from the mouth of the den to the stillness of dawn. His life a song woven with courage, with peace, with the sacred thread of presence that never loosened its hold. And though the world would move forward, though kings would rise and fall, though empires would fracture and fade like dust upon forgotten streets, the story of the den, the song of survival carried by Daniel, would remain, whispered beside fires, sung in the quiet spaces of hearts that dared to trust when fear circled near, when shadows pressed heavy, when lions roared at the edges of faith, the song reminding them that courage does not always roar, that strength unfolds often in stillness, in the quiet refusal to bend beneath pride, beneath decree, beneath the weight of a world convinced it can crush the unseen. Daniel's story, his song of survival, threaded beyond Babylon, beyond stone and law, echoing across generations, reminding all who listen that presence walks with those who trust, that peace anchors deeper than danger, that the dens of life do not define the faithful, they refine them, they reveal them, and the God who silenced lions still carries his own through every shadow, every trial, every whispered scheme of the world, steady, unbroken, near. And as Daniel stood upon the palace steps, his eyes lifted to the sky stretched wide above him, he carried that truth forward, the song of survival humming within him, quiet, steady, eternal.